encompass even these two different forms of populism, right? At least that was the goal. You can tell us how well we did. Okay. So what is populism? Populism is a very notoriously slippery concept. It is very hard to define. It's been defined as a style, a strategy, a pathology of democracies, or discourse. We settled on what's become kind of the standard definition now amongst political scientists, which is the ideational definition from Casmuda. And it basically says populism is a thin-centered ideology that considers society to be ultimately separated into two homogeneous and antagonistic groups, the pure people versus the corrupt elite, and which argues that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people, right? So this, I think at base, is a definition that all sort of versions of populism can ascribe to. Whenever you hear someone talking about the pure people and the corrupt elite, you know you've got a populist on your hands. And that populist is the one who basically is defining who are the people and who are the elite, as well as interpreting the general will on behalf of the people, right? So that's pretty common. And if you look at populists around the world, you'll see that kind of language pretty clearly. Trump uses that very frequently in the United States. So as a thin-centered ideology, populism always must have a companion ideology to give it direction and motivation. So populism isn't, it doesn't have a lot of prescriptions about what to do, what to enact, right? So it usually adopts some other ideology to give it some motivation, right? So for that, we kind of turned to some general propositions about Latin American foreign policy. I think there have been sort of attempts to kind of come up with general theories of Latin American foreign policy. I don't know that a theory has emerged yet, but there are some general axioms I think that we can find in the writings of various folks in the region and in the US as well. And so we consider three overlapping dimensions that sort of feature in Latin American foreign policy. One is pro-core versus anti-core, autonomous versus dependent, or economic versus political. And basically, pro versus anti-core foreign policy revolves around whether policymakers are agreeable or not to the dominant powers and the international order they enforce. So in the case of Latin America, that's probably a sort of positioning oneself vis-a-vis the United States and kind of the Western-led liberal international order. Autonomous versus dependent foreign policy orientations refer to the ability to develop and implement foreign policy with or without international influence. And those things, pro versus anti-core and autonomous versus dependent, often move together, right? So you tend to see pro-core and dependent foreign policy position, anti-core and autonomous foreign policy positions. And then is economic or political diplomatic policy predominant? So we look at those three sort of axioms about Latin American foreign policy and, try to combine it with role theory. So role theory, just a quick background on role theory. Role theory developed basically in sociology and family studies, anthropology, is sort of a way to understand how individuals act in organized groups, right? So obviously in family studies, you study the role of the father, the mother, the child, the aunt, so on and so forth. But we've sort of imported role theory into foreign policy analysis beginning in the 1970s with Ole Holstey's seminal work on national role conceptions. It's kind of gone in and out of fashion, I would say. I'm being generous. It has little mini resurgences. It had kind of a resurgence in the 80s, and then a little blip in the 90s, and then really has sort of come back in a big way, beginning in kind of the around 2009, 2009, sort of spontaneously there was work on role theory going on in Europe and the US. And then we kind of combined forces to sort of create a book series, which Feliciano's book is published in, and really try to do some workshops and other things to get people working on role theory. And anyway, so we thought role theory would be very useful for Latin America. And basically, when you think about role theory, the main thing we're talking about is roles, right? And we think roles are very useful to compare across cases, right? It gives you a nice entity to compare across cases. Since they're positions in an organized group, or basically any kind of person or individual it's possible to be in that society. So in the international society, leaders often articulate role conceptions for their countries all the time. Things like regional leader, ally, rival, developer, active independent, you name it, the sort of the sky is the limit. Some of these are positions in an organized system. Others are just the kind of actor it is possible to be in an international society, right? And these roles take into account both domestic and international politics. And in so doing, leaders have to take into account their own domestic politics, right? Contestation over the appropriate role for their country. Who are we facing the international system is an important question, right? And it's a political question that usually parties, legislatures, many actors in societies contest over, right? So we consider sort of three basic factors that are normally associated with sort of domestic sources of foreign policy: left, right political ideology, neoliberal or socialist economic ideology, and protectionist free trade orientation to globalization. We also note that leaders also need to have a significant other to adopt the appropriate counter role to form a meaningful role relationship. And those others would be neighbors in the region in Latin America, the United States, intergovernmental organizations. It just depends on what the situation is, right? But every role really does require a counter role, or you look like a crazy person, right? I can't be a professor if I don't have a room full of students listening to me, right? I'm just a crazy person talking to an empty room otherwise, right? So the role counter role relationship is important. So from this combination of role theory and these propositions about sort of Latin American foreign policy, we have two propositions which are very wordy, and I apologize for that. The first one really reflects on kind of the domestic dimension of role play. The role play of a populist leader in regional and extra-regional relations will be shaped by their left-right political ideology, socialist, neoliberal, socioeconomic orientation, and their protectionist or free trade orientation in response to globalization. So that's basically just accounting for these usual domestic determinants of foreign policy. The second proposition relates to the international dimension, and it really relates to how do we think populists will differ, how they enact these roles internationally that they choose, right? So this is where the axioms from Latin American foreign policy come in. So the first is the more a populist leader strives for autonomy and adopts an anti-core orientation, the more likely his or her foreign policy will reflect anti-elitist and pro-people components in its narrative and actions. So we expect the populist part to be magnified in the international sphere when the leader strives for autonomy and anti-core orientation. At the same time, the more a leader is close to the axis of dependency and pro-core, the less his or her foreign policy will show narratives and actions that reflect anti-elitism and pro-masses, despite being populist at home. So this just refers to how does the populace interact if they're more dependent and pro-core with those actors. The kinds of language that's used probably is not going to be as populist as we might expect, in part because you don't want to offend those actors. And we know lots of times when populists talk about elites, they connect domestic elites with international elites. So it's very, Chavez did that quite frequently, for example, connected the domestic oligarchs to the US elites. So that's why we think there'll be a difference across these two kinds of populists in the foreign policy realm. So the method we use is basically a kind of interpretive narrative in each of these cases. So that allows us to analyze the repertoires that give rise to roles, so that the cultural material that leaders use to develop roles, the behavioral patterns of an actor, and the rhetorical justifications of that actor when enacting the role. The narrative itself is a kind of strategy that the leader constructs with the purpose of framing that role and achieving specific foreign policy goals and interests. And so populism itself is about narrating a story of the people against an elite with the purpose of achieving the ideal nation, which again is the expression of the general will, right? And so populist leaders also advance a narration of the type of international actor they want their state to be by following principles and casting roles that help them to achieve their foreign policy goals. So the two cases, the first one is Menem's populist foreign policy of Argentina. So I'm just going to talk about the cases briefly. We can talk more about them if you like. But prior to Menem, Argentina had traditionally played an active independent role and sort of corresponding companion roles, non-aligned, developing third world state. But Menem's populist foreign policy led to a role change to faithful ally, aligned state, regional integrationist, regional integrationist and multilateralist state. And this reflected his movement toward dependency and pro-core orientations, as well as his adoption of the neoliberal economic model. So the faithful ally of the US, this is known as the period of Relaciones Carnales. The aligned state, as basically Menem abandoned principles of the non-aligned movement. The regional integrationist role as Argentina worked with Brazil in creating Mercosur, and the multilateralist state through adherence to the principles and rules of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. So the pro-people and anti-elitism present as neoliberal reforms would benefit the people at the expense of bureaucrats and other corrupt elites targeted by reforms. So you see that language. But as expected, this dimension is not as important in the international realm, right? So the populism is really directed domestically because the corrupt elites are really the bureaucrats who are holding us back. In Chavez's case, so Venezuela had previously been a friend and partner of the US. But Chavez's strong anti-core autonomy and socialist agendas led to new roles, such as anti-imperialist agent, a liberator role, bastion of the revolution, and enemy rival of the US, right? So his socialism of the 21st century basically rejected neoliberalism, as we know, and his Bolivarian revolution presented alternatives to US leadership in the region and US-led institutions, right? The populist elements were strong domestically and internationally. So this is that case, right? As expected. So corrupt elites within Venezuela were connected to the US and other imperialist agents, according to Chavez. And Chavez himself identified very closely with his pure people, right? Often considering himself their savior or messiah, if you listen to Allo Presidente or read his writings. So in conclusion, I don't know, did I go 20 minutes? Have I stretched this out? There is no single form taken by populist foreign policy, right? We have to acknowledge that populist foreign policy is going to differ by populists, right? But populism as a thin-centered ideology needs companion ideologies to give it direction. So in Latin America, we think those three axioms provided the elements for populists to formulate their foreign policies. And then roles provided us a means to observe them. And then role theory helps us to understand how populism interacts with traditional domestic determinants of foreign policy. And we think that the combination of theory plus the comparison of cases, and that's the key, the comparison of cases provides knowledge that we would not have otherwise obtained. So hopefully, future work might say, well, Wenner and Thies proposed this approach to thinking about populist foreign policy in Latin America, and they use these two cases. Let me apply them to some other cases and see if this middle range theory holds or not, right? So there's potential future, I think, for application to other Latin American cases, and then potentially to think about how would we transpose this to study other cases of populism in other regions around the world. And if you are interested in reading more, it just came out in International Relations, the article version of this. So feel free to look it up, or if you don't have access to it, I'm happy to email you a copy. Just send me an email. So that's all I have to say. Hopefully I was able to stress some of the comparative aspects of this case, of these two cases, and why we think the comparative part of foreign policy is so important to creating some general theory that you can then test across cases.
Thanks a lot, Cameron, for your excellent presentation. I'm sure that it will bring about some questions concerning the use of populism as a concept and the comparative aspect on role theory of your research. I'm going to give the floor immediately to Feliciano. Feliciano, I'm sure that he's going to use 30 minutes.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Thank you, the Brazilian Association of Political Science, for organizing this panel for us. I'm very happy to be here with colleagues that I like very much, like Carlos, Maria Regina. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. And of course, Cameron, who is being a role, not sure we are talking about role theory. Cameron, more than anyone, is a role model for me and for many other academics in the studies of role theory. So I'd like, please, to share the presentation. Sandro, se puder colocar minha apresentação, por favor. So as Carlos mentioned in the beginning, the idea of this panel is to stimulate in Brazil the debate about comparative foreign policy. As we all know, based on the literature of Brazilian foreign policy in the last 20 years or so, there's been an increase in Brazil, in Latin America in general, to do comparative foreign policy. So the panel here, and also the panels that we are organizing in December on the Social Sciences Association, are going to help to increase the numbers of comparative studies in Brazil. So this is and that's why the reasons we decided to invite Cameron. Cameron has been doing comparative studies for quite some time, and we do believe that increasing the number of comparative studies in Brazil, especially looking at ways of using comparative study to promote mid-range theories of international relations, will definitely help Brazilians to publish more often abroad, due to the demand of many journals on this kind of studies, right? So the idea here is to present the main aspects of my latest book that got published last year, A Theory of Massive Roles Transition, Small Powers Changing Region Hegemons. It was published by Routledge on the Role Theory series that Cameron mentioned in his presentation. As you can go online and look for the series, there are many very interesting books already published by the series, and the idea of the series is to foster it, to increase the number of the studies of role theory. And as Cameron mentioned, there is like a new rise of role theory worldwide, not only in Europe and in the United States, but also in Latin America and other regions. So I'm very happy to participate in this new rise of role theory studies. So I'm just going to tell a little bit of this, the history behind this book. This book is the development of a paper I published with my advisee, Martin, in 2017, and foreign policy analysis, in which we use role theory to analyze one specific case, which is the negotiation of the supply of gas between Bolivia and Brazil during Evo Morales and Lula da Silva presidencies in 2006-2007. On that specific study, we use a series of role theory concepts to understand the case, and we use the case to clarify some aspects that were still not very well clarified in role theory. So the idea of that paper, we had both deductive and an inductive approach, right? So, but after finding out those results, I had the feeling that I could expand the causal mechanism that we found in this FPA paper of 2017. So that's the beginning of my book. So this is the cover, the beautiful cover of the book, right? So the idea was that by studying one specific case, we come up with this still flawed, but more or less intelligible causal mechanism that explain how a small power was able to influence and change the master role of a regional power. So when you study both role theory, socialization studies, and role theory, and also small powers, you rarely expect that a small country is able to change or to influence the change of a regional power dominant role. So master role, as you can see there, it's the master role transition, which is the change from one dominant role to another, is one usually in the literature is the regional power itself that makes this change, right? It has pressures from the international system, it has pressure from the regional system, but it's the regional power itself that makes this change for one reason or another. There were very few studies that were trying to understand if small powers had some role on this change. So our study in 2017 piece of foreign policy analysis, we're showing, and we argued on that paper, that Bolivia was able almost to make a socialization process with Brazil, was changing Brazil according to their interests, which is a very bold and a very strong argument that we in this book I tried to understand better. So the idea there is that we came up with this causal mechanism that we wanted to change, we wanted to test in different cases, right? So that's the beginning of the book. So from 2017 to 2019, I developed the book, which is a study of 5 cases in three different regions of small powers changing or influences regional powers master roles. Right? So the idea was trying to expand the causal mechanism that I found in one paper to a series of cases. Of course, by doing these expansions, I had to change and to adapt the causal mechanism, as we will see in this paper. So in this book, we propose a master. Let me go back here because I'm covering my. I cannot see what my presentation here. Let me just. How do I do that? Here. So in this book, we propose a mid-range theory of a master role transition. So, and that's very important for comparative studies. We developed a causal mechanism for one specific case. In order to turn this to have some generability from that specific causal mechanism, we have to come up with a theory, or in this case, a mid-range theory, a theory that explains a bounded context, or that is, a theory that can explain similar cases from the one that where the whole story began, which is the Bolivia-Brazil case, right? So that's the jump, the transition that we made from the paper to the book, right? So master role transition, which is the most important concept and the dependent variable of the study, means the replacement of an active dominant role by a dormant or inactive role located within one's role repertoire. So every regional power has a dominant role that the political elite of that specific government decides for its government on that specific region. Right? In the master role transition is one for reasons beyond the interests of the regional power. This dominant role transits changes from one specific dominant to another one, which is dormant or inactive within one's repertoire of roles. So role theory says that we don't have only one role, we have many multiple roles. Depending on the interaction, we change the roles. So we have like a sort of a pyramid of a one master role and many other roles that are dominant, they are dormant or inactive, right? And we will see there is the role of natural leader, and there are many others like regional hegemon, regional paymasters. These are other roles that Brazil, India, and South Africa, the three regional powers that we studied, had before the interaction with this small power, right? So let me see if now goes to the next one, right? So oops. So what is the puzzle of the study? The first puzzle is that can small powers change the identity of regional powers, or the role, which is more properly the concept of regional powers, or can small powers accomplish their foreign policy goals with the opposition of regional powers? So when you look at the literature with small powers, that's rarely the option. They lack material power, so they can't change. They lack capacity of coalition building, so they cannot change either. They have low agency capacity, and the result is always the regional powers' dominance in the region. So regional powers have very little room to maneuver in regional settings. Right? So if you look at the literature of small powers, you rarely find some studies that show small powers vis-a-vis regional powers accomplish their goals, especially if they go against the regional power. Right? So by studying the Bolivia case, and which is a very interesting case, I had the insight, or like the intuition, that there is more to it. That by using non-material strategies, small powers were able, or they could at some point, influence the change of master roles for regional powers. Right? So, oops, again. Oh, I always press twice. Now this time 4 times. I have to wait a little bit. Again, right? So how do we? So in any qualitative analysis, and contrary to quantitative analysis, I was looking for the dependent variable. So it's like a selection bias, a strong selection bias. So I was looking for cases in which I more or less knew the dependent variable was also positive. That is, I was looking for cases in which I knew they were similar somewhat to the Bolivian cases. But I also knew that in order to build up a mid-range theory, I needed negative cases, or I needed cases that were as similar as possible as the Bolivian case in terms of the independent variables, but had some variation in the dependent variable. So cases in which a small power use a similar strategy to change the regional power's master role, which is a strategy that they were trying to win in some negotiation, and they didn't accomplish their goal, right? So by looking at the negative and the positive by the variation in the dependent variable, I could build up the set of conditions that will most likely lead to a master role transition. So I started to look for outliers, right? Outliers for the small powers literatures, right? Small powers that were able to win these negotiations. Right? So I wanted to understand the conditions for outliers to succeed. And I also wanted to understand whether there was a pattern for outliers' success, right? So what were my main motivations? Well, what were the rare instances in which small powers did accomplish their goals against regional powers? In which foreign policy instruments, based on role theory, they used to that effect? Right? So let's see if I get right now. The next slide. Right. So my original paper on FPA paper, I had only three independent variables, if you call it, 3 conditions: alter casting strategy that I'm going to explain a little bit, regional contestation, and domestic contestation. By expanding the cases to 5, I came up with this one extra condition, which is the asymmetrical economic interdependence between the small powers and regional powers, and I'll explain a little bit why this one is very important. So the main argument of the book is that we argue that only a combination of 4 necessary conditions can produce a full master role transition in regional interaction. So even by looking at all these cases that I found, that some small powers were able to change regional powers master roles, it was very, very difficult for small powers to change regional powers master role transition. When I made the first presentation of this book in I think it was a LASA meeting in Boston 2 years ago, there were 2 Paraguayan diplomats on the audience. One of the cases that I'm going to show is between Brazil and Paraguay. And they're like, well, we really like the presentation. It's amazing how Fernando Lugo, the Paraguayan president, managed to win this negotiation with Brazil. But do you see now that the new president can also renegotiate the Itaipu, which is the dam the Brazil and Paraguay shares on the border, and they were renegotiating the treaty of the electrical of the dam. And I said, look, do you see this 3 or 4 conditions happening again? I said, no, none of them are able again. So the new president of Paraguay will not be able to win this negotiation the same way that Lugo was able to against Lula, right? So they were like, oh yeah, and then the discussion unfolded from there. And so because it is still very difficult, small powers, that's not the expectations. So you never expect that small powers have any room to change a regional powers master role. So in order to happen, as I will show in the presentation, all these 4 conditions must be positive. They must happen in the same, more or less, sequence, right? Again, next one. Oops. So one, just to, oh my God. I just want to clarify what outer casting means for those who don't know role theory very well, which is very important, is the key component of success, right? So outer casting is the literature of role theory define outer casting as a projecting an identity to be assumed by others, with whom one is in interaction which is congruent to one's own goals. This means that actors seeks to persuade others of their definition of the role by seeking to change the role of others. What does it mean for the cases that we analyze? The small powers needs to project a counter role, right? A different role from the role of the regional power defining itself on that moment. During the Bolivian crisis, what Evo Morales did against Lula was calling Brazil an imperialist power, right? So Brazil had the dominant role or master role of a natural regional leader, especially during Lula administration, right? Brazil is the regional leader of South America. Now you cannot say, like, for example, this role does not exist during Bolsonaro administration at all. Right? Bolsonaro gave up the idea of regional leadership. The idea was very important for Lula. So Brazil had this natural regional leader, and regional leader in Thies includes some specific foreign policy agenda towards its neighbors. And Bolivia was saying the opposite of that. So Brazil is not a regional power. Brazil is an imperialist power that tries to use its economic power against a small country like Bolivia at the expense of the Bolivian people. So this is an outer casting. One small power, in this case I'm studying out, but it can be any country. One small power is outer casting the dominant role of the regional power. So this is a key feature. So in order to understand if a small power is able to change a regional power master role, one needs to understand if the small powers is using outer castings. The outer casting is the trigger of the whole process, right? So these actors, the small powers, seeks to persuade others, and this others is the regional powers, of their definition of their own role by seeking to change their role, right? So we do not accept, Brazil, that you're saying that you're a regional leader. In fact, you are imperialist power, and we want you to change from an imperialist power to a more benign role, which is a regional paymaster. So in order to be a regional, you have to pay for it, right? So that's what Morales starts to do it against Lula, and as I will show to you, it was very successful, right? Not only for that reason. So, but this is a necessary condition. So this is altercasting. I will explain the other conditions as well. Oops, back again. So we use three literatures in the group: role theory literatures, which is reframing the concept of status, regional powerhood status. Small powers, with finding evidences of success using behavioral based role theory behavioral models. In regional powers, right? Understanding regional powers as target and not as agents of regional socialization schemes. In the literature of regional powers that I forgot to mention, usually a regional power is the one that socializes the small power. So the most common example, based on Jeffrey Chekhov's papers, is the European Union. France and Germany, they socialize Portugal and Spain into the European Union. After that, after they join the European Union, so Portugal and Spain, for example, never go back to be a dictatorship, because once they're inside the international organization, the European Union, they have been socialized, right? So most of the studies of socialization, they look at how regional powers or great powers socialize as small powers or small countries, right? Here we're trying to change this causality. We're trying to look into how small powers are able to change, but they are not able to socialize by itself the regional powers, but by changing the way the regional powers understand themselves and their regional roles, they also change the regional setting, because the regional powers is key to understand. The way the regional powers understand itself is key to understand how the region is built up in terms of roles, right? So let's next. Right, so we use in this case a most similar design, as I said. So the 5 cases are the 2006 Bolivian Brazilian gas crisis. 2009 is the Paraguayan Brazilian Itaipu Dam crisis. 2009 Ecuadorian Brazilian Odebrecht crisis. Lesotho South African Operation Boleas, which is a military operation in Lesotho, a very small country inside South Africa, in 1998 during Mandela administration. And in 1996 India Bangladesh Ganges water crisis, which is the India and Bangladesh are disputing how they can use the water of the Ganges River, right? So most similar design is that this is more or less how the causal mechanism work, right? So here, number one, you have the master role, which is a natural leader. I'm using Brazil as an example. Then you have all these dormant auxiliary roles, which is hesitant leader, paymaster, regional paymaster, hegemonic leader, aggressive leader. So number two is the small power altercasting Brazil, which is calling Brazil, look, you are an imperialist power. And then comes the next conditions, which are the other conditions as they are very important, which is the regional contestation and the domestic contestation. In order for the causal mechanism to work, the altercasting needs to activate division within the regional power administration. So that was in the 2006 case, and I believe, and also the Paraguayan case in 2009. That's typical. When Bolivia and Paraguay starting to call, they both call Brazil an imperialist country, right? When they both started to call Brazil an imperialist country, that created division within Lula's administration. If you look at, and in the book I showed this, how senators on the Congress starting to call Lula, senators from the Workers' Party, which is Lula's party, is starting to call Lula to say, look, you have to accept Bolivia's and Paraguay demands. Otherwise, this is not gonna, we have to have a solidarity. The foreign policy needs to be based on solidarity. We cannot impose our vision over the gas or over the Itaipu Dam agreement. We need to include them. And also there is a division within the administration in terms of the ministry. Petrobras has one position. The Ministry of Foreign Policy has the Foreign Affairs Minister, Celso Amorim, has another position. So when Bolivia altercasts, Brazil creates division within the government, right? But not only that, because that's important, but that's not sufficient. That's not enough. You need another condition, which is the regional contestation, which means another regional power, which is a secondary power in the case of both Bolivia and Paraguay, but also on the case of Ecuador, was Venezuela during the height of Chavez administration, right? Chavez was doing well. Venezuela had a lot of money from oil, and they had all the ALBA. The ALBA was still going on. Venezuela had some influence. And in these 3 cases, in two of the positive cases, which is Paraguay and Bolivia, Chavez sided with Bolivia and Paraguay against Brazil. Chavez also sided with Correa in Ecuador against Brazil, but as I can show you in the map a little bit, that was not enough to change Brazil's behavior towards Ecuador on the Odebrecht crisis of 2009, right? So one country, the small power, outcasts the regional power. And then two other conditions, they come in together in order to work out. You need the regional contestation, and you also need the domestic division, right? Based on a asymmetrical economic interdependence, right? Which is Brazil dependent more or less on Bolivia. Bolivia depended way more on Brazil because Brazil is the main buyer of Bolivia's gas, but also Bolivia is Brazil's #1 supplier of the gas. Without this economic interdependence, it's unlikely that the small power has the leverage against the regional power. This is very important, for example, to Ecuador. One of the reasons that Ecuador is a negative case, that Correa was not able to change Brazil's behavior on the Brazil's master role on the Ecuadorian crisis of the Odebrecht, was because Brazil and Ecuador have no economic interdependence in the same level that Brazil has with Paraguay and Bolivia, right? So once these four conditions operate together, you have this very strong questioning of the national leader initial master role, and then you have another master role which is positively valued, right? So both Bolivia and Venezuela, but also the domestic opposition, starting to say to the Brazilian administration, especially to Lula and Celso Amorim and Petrobras, the three actors that were very resistant at the beginning, said that you have to pay more to Bolivia. You have to change that. That you can complain that Bolivia used all those methods that they used during the crisis, but you have to pay more for the gas, right? So this is the mechanism that makes the transition of the master roles, right? It starts from a natural leader to a regional paymaster in the case of Brazil. So once you look at the disposition of the cases, because I don't have time to go in each one of the cases, this is more or less the distribution of master roles. So in the Brazil-Bolivia crisis was natural leader, Brazil-Paraguay natural leader, Brazil-Ecuador natural leader as well. The South Africa-Lesotho was regional hegemon, which is different from regional leader. And the India-Bangladesh was the dominant country, right, in South Asia. And then there's a small power outcasting, which is calling Brazil an imperialist neighbor, then calling Brazil against imperialist. As you can see, if you call Brazil an imperialist, especially if there is a leftist president in Brazil, and if this leftist president is called an imperialist, it shakes the way of they understand the regional setting, right? So it's very effective if you call Brazil an imperialist country. And then I used the South African case, which is a very interesting case. It's a failed outcasting because the situation in Lesotho during the 1998 crisis is so terrible, it's so complicated that the Lesothans, the Basotho, that's how we call it, the Basotho administration was not able to promote a stable outcasting. And then in the India-Bangladesh case, which is a positive case, Bangladesh is starting to call India many times an hegemonic neighbor, right? And that was very effective, especially because Bangladesh was calling India a hegemonic neighbor in international organizations and multilateral settings, right? So then you have the master role transition, which is the final column here, which is a master roles result, regional paymaster, two negative cases, 3 and 4. The small power was not able to change the master role of the regional power. Then you have another positive case, which is India made a transition from a dominant role to a cooperative neighbor, right? Which is paying more for the Ganges. Actually, it's not money; it's how they control the water, the flow of the water in the river. Right? Let me go to the last ones. And then you have the disposition of the conditions here, right? So this is it shows how comparative the study is. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4 conditions or independent variable if you use the quantitative concepts, and then you have the dependent variable, which is the master role transition, MRT, and then you can see Bolivia and Brazil. So you can see that only when the 4 conditions are together, are positive, then you have the transition to the master role on the regional power, which means in order to be, for small powers, in order to be able to change a regional power's master role, one needs 4 necessary conditions. So if one of the conditions is out, then you cannot make the change, which is South Africa, for example, there are 2 conditions out. In the Ecuador, there are 3 conditions out, so they can never change, right? So that's why it's important to have a negative case vis-a-vis a positive case, because the negative case works as an alternative explanation for the positive case. Usually when you have only one case study, you make your argument, so this is the causal mechanism, but then there is always someone who can come up with an alternative explanation. By using comparative analysis, especially if you have a negative case compared to a positive case, you can show the importance of the conditions that lead to the dependent variable. So that's why I always tell my students in the methodology class that I teach at University of São Paulo, the importance of negative cases to sustain a mid-range theory, because they work as alternative explanations. Because one can say, well, maybe the condition number 3 is not very important, and you should look, by studying the Ecuador cases, I can show you that the condition number 3, which is domestic acquisition, is very important. The fact that this one was negative is one of the reasons that led to a negative result, right, in a dependent variable. I think that's most of it. Let me see if there's another slide. Oops. I think there is one last slide. So I used in the book 3 main literature groups, the literature of master roles or role theory. So at the conclusion, I have some speculations of what the findings can say to the role theory literature. Then I have the same for the regional powers literature and the same for small powers literature. So the idea here was to mobilize 3 groups of literature using a comparative studies analysis that produces a mid-range theory and then gives back to these 3 literature groups insights of how to develop these 3 different literature groups. So that's it. Thank you very much for your, I don't know if I was very clear in my presentation, but thank you very much for the opportunity, and we are open for questions. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Feliciano. I'm sure there will be lots of questions for you during the Q&A. Now I give the floor to Maria Regina for her comments and questions, critical remarks. And Regina, the floor is yours.
Okay, and thank you, Carlos. Thank you, ABCP, for inviting me for this session. And thank you, Cameron and Feliciano, for their papers, which I read with a lot of interest. But I'm going to make a typical female disclaimer. As I read today, I received yesterday at night, I didn't have the time to arrange or to organize my comments. This is typical female disclaimer. You know why? Okay, but that's true. Okay, and I think I like it to read the papers. They're both very challenging in terms of analytical and theoretical terms. And I should start with Cameron. Cameron's paper. I have 15 minutes now, so I hope to with my bagunça, as we say in Portuguese, I can organize something meaningful. Well, I like Cameron. Let me say immediately my discomfort. I have a discomfort with the term, with the concept of populism, because I think. If you work with the concept of populism, you have to have a theory of populism. And your theory or otherwise theories, I think is a little thing in the sense that what populism is. You said that populism is a thin ideology that works only when you have a companion ideology, a rightist ideology or leftist ideology, but populism is a thin ideology. And in a sense, your hypothesis is that in the 2 cases you analyze, that governments I think Menon is complicated because he is a typical, I don't remember the name, that switch in Portuguese we say how you say when you vote expecting something and the leader when it's elected does exactly the opposite. Estelionato eleitoral. I don't know.
Switch. Policy
switch. So typical policy switch. It came from justicialism, etc. But what determines his foreign policy was his ideology. I mean, his ideology that he adopted as an opportunistic leader. Okay, and in the case of Venezuela, Chavez was a leader that came from socialist rank, and so she was an anti-core. He had the anti-core foreign policy. So, what the concept of populism add to your argument? That's my major question. Because I don't know, well, the term populist was invented in the case of Latin America, but it was a concept that was very ethnocentric in the sense that countries that have a pro-people or a social inclusive domestic policy were considered populist. And now, as you have Trump, and then you have Bolsonaro, and then you have Chavez, they are all populist leaders. So let me put this way: in the 30s and in the 30s, you have a crisis of liberal democracy, and then you have fascism and socialism. They are anti-elites, and they are pro-people. They develop a narrative that they were for people. They are against the elites. But one was fascist and the other was socialist. So I think it's very interesting the way you link the traditional foreign policy axioms of Latin American foreign policy to road theory. I think that's for me, it's the most interesting finding of your paper. I'm not sure we can call. I'm not sure about the analytical benefits from using populism, because I think, maybe what is the major characteristics of countries that you are in the global south? Generally, they are very unequal countries with a very small elite. And in democracy, the people who compete for power, for presidents, they have to have a narrative for people. Otherwise, they don't get elected. People in a very unequal country, they can't be elected only with the support of upper class and the middle class. They need part of the middle class and the majority of the lower class. So this pro-people and this anti-state maybe is a characteristic of countries that have a very unequal distribution of income, where nobody's going to be elected if it has only a narrative or discourse of against people. I mean, a very elite discourse. So they have to be for people, and they have to be against the traditional elite. So I don't know which will be. I think most of the populists that interest the literature are against democracy. And I think this is a major division. If a populist leader is against democracy and a populist is for democracy, what populist brings in terms of conceptual richness to the... I think we have to use populism. We have to have a theory of populism. And I don't see too much of a theory of populism if you start with the idea of a thin a thin ideology, and needs another support of another ideology to understand their foreign policy behavior. Even if because the foreign policy behavior is in the sense an effect of their companion ideology. And maybe even if they behave similarly, like Menom and Chavez behave similarly at the domestic realm, they have this dilemma of having to court the people, I mean, the lower class. I give you an example. Bolsonaro hates people. He hates, but he discovered that cash transfer enlarge his recognition among the people, enlarge his electoral performance, future electoral performance. So I think if you just role theory and traditional axioms of foreign policy, yeah, I think they will help you to explain the difference between the similarities and difference in the domestic and the foreign realm. Because in your cases, the most important cause or factor, dimension of foreign policy orientation is their ideology, the ideology of the leader, of the governor, and not. So this is I mean the incongruence in terms of domestic politics is, I think, is caused by this dilemma that to be elected you have to court the people, otherwise you're not going to be elected. In case of very unequal countries, where you have a small elite, a middle class, and a large lower class people. Well, I don't know, yeah, but I enjoy your paper, and I think it would be nice to make some kind of I don't know, some kind of dialogue with the 30s, where you have exactly what we have experienced now. We experience a crisis of liberal democracy, and we experienced the crisis of liberal democracy in the 30s, and then you have fascism and socialism, two major, completely different orientations. So I think if you work on that, I think, I don't know, I think you should do an effort to build a theory of populism. There's no, if you have a concept, you have to have a theory of the concept. And I don't see very much a theory of populism in the paper. I see a very interesting theory on the axioms of foreign policy, traditional foreign policy, and role theory. Okay, that's it. Yeah, Feliciano. Very interesting. This role theory application on the small, how small powers can reconfigure, change power configurations. That's it. I think it's very interesting. And sometimes I have the impression that role is almost a synonymous of interest, like being a benign hegemon is a role, is an interest. I'm not sure. Sometimes I have this impression, and also as on your, I have also on terms of the logical scheme, is very similar with different words and different concepts from the Putnam two-level games. With the only difference that in the Putnam two-level games, both you suppose now they try to enlarge the win set, and in the case of a very unequal negotiation or whatever, the small countries tries to limit his win set and try to enlarge the win set of his opponent or partner. The difference, and some of the difference is the strategies that they use. But even the strategies that they use are similar of what Putnam called whatever we have to call, I forgot the name of it. In his, you try to influence the, okay, I have it here. I told you, I have someplace. Restructuring and restriction of your enemy work partner. You can restructure by using discursive strategy, but this discursive strategy has to be politically effective in the other country. But that's the same. I mean, as the idea is to enlarge the wind set of your partner, whatever, of the major power, of the regional power, and the small countries try to maintain his wind set small. And in this case, I ask you, I don't know. Well, I studied road theory when I was in sociology much years ago, but I don't know exactly. I think it's very interesting what you said about the four components and the four conditions. And I start with the material interdependence. In your case, you have 3 cases where material interdependence exists, asymmetrical material. And the case that was not successful didn't have a material interdependence. I understand. Because in the case of Brazil, I know more about the case of Brazil and the case of, I'm sorry, Bolivia and Paraguay. They was asymmetric in both ways. So the asymmetry creates additional alliance inside Brazil. Because we need São Paulo, the interest in São Paulo depends on the Bolivian gas. And the interest of the South, and the energy of the South of Brazil depends on the Itaipu. So it is a very huge asymmetry. I don't know about the others. And so this is a necessary condition for some kind of success. You need the other ones, but this is, I think, was more important. I don't know. I don't know I just saw your anyway. And well, Carlos is saying that I ran off time, but I think it's very interesting this idea of outer casting. And I imagine, for example, in the case of Latin America and U.S. relation, it didn't work. Why? We have thousands of books calling U.S. imperialists. Maybe they don't care. They don't even consider that. I mean, it's more important in case of region. I don't know. And you said something that I would like you to tell me. You have the role. You have a special role before the interaction. I thought, I'm not sure about that. Okay, you said Brazil has a role of natural leader, no? Or natural leader, regional leader, paymaster, and for the outcasting process, it was put on question. But I don't know. I think you might have like I'm not sure if you construct the role in the interaction. I'm not sure because I think in the case of Brazil didn't expect this kind of reaction from I don't know. Maybe you have some kind of interaction. Maybe in your case studies, you notice that. And also, I would like you to talk a little about this kind of asymmetry, because I think this asymmetry is the necessary and the first condition. Without this condition, the process doesn't have. It's not that you don't. The process doesn't continue. I don't know. Anyway, I like very much, and I'm sorry, it's a little disjointed comments, but as I have to do it right now because I didn't have the time, because I was outside Rio, and I arrived yesterday night and had just the morning for doing that. I'm sorry, I didn't read the papers with all the careful I should read, given the interesting work that you have done. Thank you.
Thank you, Regina. It was very good. No, it was not disjoint, don't worry.
Thanks a lot, Regina. I wish all comments were as disjoint and disconnected as yours, because at least disconnected comments will always be very helpful then. I'm going to add up 2 or 3 comments to each of you, and then I'll give you back the floor before we open for Q&A, so that we can have something like half an hour of Q&A with our audience in case they send us questions. The first comment that I'm going to give is to Cameron. It's about your proposition number 2. Right, that's a slide that you presented propositions, and on proposition number 2 concerning the international dimension, you said the more a populist leader strives for autonomy and adopts an anti-core orientation, the more likely his or her foreign policy will reflect anti-elitist or pro-people components in its narrative and actions. And my issue here has to do with, for example, combinations of more autonomy or less autonomy and pro-core orientation, right, which means the opposite. Would that reflect a populist leadership, or would all populist leaderships necessarily have to adopt an anti-core orientation and a quest for autonomy? Because then I wouldn't be able to fit Bolsonaro, for example, under the label of populist leadership, for example, or I wouldn't be able to label Modi, India's Modi, under the label of populist. And I think that is just to add a little bit to the question that Maria Regina has asked you about the utility and the usefulness of populism as a concept. Whenever I'm working on concepts and on theories, I always try to look for an opposite concept. And then my question would be, what would be the opposite concept to populism? Would that be democracy, representative democracy, liberal democracy? What would be the opposite concept of populism in political science when I try to look for this in literature and empirical studies, etc. The second issue has to do with the concept of elite, because when you take the examples of Brazil, Hungary, India, or even in the US, or in Turkey, or in the Philippines, I mean, the number of leaders and countries outside the world which are currently being called as populist leaders or neo-populist leaders, they are very broad. But some of them, they may have an anti-cultural elite, cosmopolitan elite posture, but not necessarily an anti-financial elite positioning, which is the case, for example, of Bolsonaro. He's very much against some parts of the elite, and normally those elite members that are more educated, formally, those who belong to the diplomatic spheres, for example, those who believe in the existence of a kind of a cosmopolitan policy out there, and so on and so forth. But he's not against bankers, he's not against agribusiness men and women, he's not against, I mean, a segment of our economic and financial elite members, which are extremely important as members of the power coalition in support of his government. And then perhaps opening up the box of who the elite members actually are would also help us building new types of typologies to understand the variations and perhaps the usefulness or not of the concept of populism for the sake of comparisons, right? And to Feliciano, my question has to do with your conditions, because I was also thinking, because you used a very and that's fine, I'm not against Max Weber, right? But he used a very Weberian way of putting necessary and sufficient conditions in order to, but if you use Wittgenstein's philosophy of building concepts, then you have to check, perhaps, and that's perhaps useful in the sense of checking the intensity of each condition, because then you go into the interaction of agents in their socializations in the region. And perhaps it's just a provocation. I'm not telling you to abandon Max Weber, but perhaps Wittgenstein can also bring something in addition to that and help you build something different methodologically, because the combination of different intensities of each of these conditions perhaps also matter a lot for us to understand why in some cases there are changes of roles and why in other cases there aren't changes in the role of the regional power that you are trying to analyze and empirically understand. But as Regina, I also enjoyed a lot listening to you and reading your work. This was not the first time I've read your work, and I've read you before, of course. And with having said that, I'm going to give you 5 or 10 minutes to each so that you can react, and then we're going to check for questions from the audience. I already have one here so far, but please, Cameron, feel free to answer and react, and then Feliciano, please.
All right, well, thank you both for the feedback. And yeah, I guess I'm glad you were disorganized, Maria Regina. your comments were very pointed the way they were, so, so thank you for that. I understand your discomfort with the concept of populism, and I think that goes across some of Carlos's comments as well. As I mentioned, I think on the slide I had, there's probably 5 or 6 known ways that people have defined populism, none of which satisfy anyone. It is probably the slipperiest, most difficult concept I've ever worked with. And as Carlos mentioned, you know, I think that's always good advice to think about what Gertz would call the positive pole of a concept and its negative, like what's the opposite? I don't really know what the opposite of populism in this ideational definition is. And I'm not sure that I know what it is more broadly, right? It is a kind of, I think the concept is somewhat deficient in that way, and probably could use some more thorough investigation about what the significant, you know, the constituent properties of that concept are. So is it, you know, it's sort of the one we're working with now that seems to predominate is this, it's got to have, you know, anti-corrupt elite, pro-virtuous people, general will predominate, right? Maybe that's just not enough, right? And what I think what we find in this paper is what you point out. It's sort of the other ideology that seems to do all the work, right? So is there any way to think about populism such that it is a thicker ideology? And I don't have a good answer for you for that right now. But it's interesting that you said, Maria Regina, to go back to the 30s. You know, I've talked about this with Leslie and other people, and we can't figure out in the existing frameworks how to connect these 3 waves of populism, because the first one seems so different, dramatically different in some ways than the other 2 in Latin America. But maybe it is something about this crisis of democracy that somehow links them all. Just before this conversation, I was actually involved in an International Political Science Association meeting talking about threats to democracy and the crisis of multilateralism, and I was talking about populism, right? So I think you're on to something, Maria Regina. There's something there that's worth exploring. So I definitely appreciate that sort of the push in that direction. And I'm glad you like the connection between role theory and thinking about traditional determinants of Latin American foreign policy. I've done some other stuff. I have an article in FPA on Chavez you'd probably like a whole lot better, because that's as far as I go with it in that article. Maybe I'll send that one to you. Yeah, so thank you, Maria Regina, for your comments. It's very stimulating. And Carlos, let's see. Proposition 2 also had the opposite. So you can be anti-core and autonomous, and also pro-core and dependent. I think that's the only real variation we get out of this thin-centered definition of populism, is so whether you are very populist in your rhetoric at home and abroad, or just at home. And maybe that's not enough, right? Maybe that's trivial, right? Maybe it's not really very interesting. I could certainly grant you that. In terms of questions about the elite, now that's interesting. I think most of the populist people would just say, well, the populist, him or herself, defines who the elite are, just as they define who the people are, right? So it's really a constructivist kind of account of this. It's the populist manipulating who is who, right? So you could be anti-cultural elite at the same time that you're cozy with bankers, right? It's actually really tricky to try to apply this often, to think about. I mean, I don't know, for Trump, I'm not sure who the virtuous people are. They don't seem to benefit from his policies, right? All the people that are normally included in the virtuous people, like farmers, sort of workers who've lost their jobs due to transformation in the economy, none of the policies he enacts benefits them. And his anti-elite seems to be, it's like Hollywood people and Democrats. I don't know. So it is hard, I think, to sort of pinpoint how these leaders do construct who are elites and who are the people. But I think the idea of maybe trying to come up with a taxon or a typology of that, that could be interesting, actually. I think that you could get some mileage out of that. So yeah, okay, I'll shut up. But thank you. Those are really interesting concepts, and it'll help me sort of think more about this as we move forward with this research agenda. So thank you.
Feliciano?
Thank you, Maria Regina and Carlos, for very good comments. I will try to answer most of them. First, I think about the asymmetrical condition, that asymmetric economic interdependence condition that Maria Regina pointed out. I had, when I designed, as I said in the presentation, when I first designed the causal mechanism, that was not a condition that I was thinking about, right? So I was only thinking about this 3 role-based conditions, right? But studying the case, when I started to add new cases, I knew that there was something out there that the role-based strategy were not capturing. So I needed to rethink and to understand that in order to understand what was going on, it was impossible just to use role-based characterization, right? So I needed to have more of that. So economic interdependence appeared to me as an important conditions once I studied the South African case. So I had the South African case, and then I looked at there was an obvious economic interdependence between the two, because in the same way that Bolivia and Brazil are interconnected with the gas, Lesotho and South Africa are interconnected with the water, right? Most of the water that goes to Johannesburg comes from Lesotho. So they need, and also because Lesotho is a very high land, so all the water there goes down to Johannesburg. So there was an economic independence there. And there was no economic independence in the Ecuadorian case, because Ecuador and Brazil, compared to Ecuador, to Brazil and Paraguay, Brazil and Bolivia are not economically interdependent, right? Because Ecuador exports oil and exports fruits to the United States on the international market. Brazil is not a big trade partner of Ecuador. So by studying these 2 negative cases, I realized economic independence was a necessary condition, but it was not a sufficient condition for master road transition, right? So in all cases that were positive, economic interdependence played a very important role. But in one case in which there was an economic interdependence, which is the South African case, it was not enough to produce a master road transition. So that's why I play with the necessity and sufficient condition. And in this case, unfortunately, there are only necessary conditions for a master role transition, which shows that it's very difficult for small powers to reach their goal and to change a regional power master role in any interaction, because they need 4 congruent conditions in order to be able to achieve their goal. So and then I realized that it was not enough. So I needed, and it was obvious to me at that point that some role-based strategy was important to reach the goal of those negotiations, right? So, and that goes to the to the question about role interest, right? So, and from my reading, and Cameron can explain this better, is that roles create interests, right? Depending on the role interaction one actor has with another, the interests might change, but they are usually based on roles. So this distinction between interest and role are not very easy to separate in an empirical analysis, right? So usually what you have to do, and what I did in this book, is I come up with a list of master roles that I more or less could find out in a discursive analysis from the regional powers and the small powers as well, right? And then from there, I tried to derive and to analyze the interests, the economic or political interests that were created based on the roles that I assumed previously, right? But empirically talking, is very difficult to disentangle these 2 categories, because they show up in the discourse mixed up, so it's very difficult to separate. So I always struggle with these differences, and I think that's a problem of role theory in general. Cameron can help me that and can explain that better. He has been dealing with this for a long time. It's funny that Regina mentioned Putnam, Robert Putnam, is that I read and I thought of Putnam, but I can't remember if when I was writing the paper or writing the book, that I ever thought about the 2-level analysis of Putnam, because my whole motivation in the paper was trying to understand and to use role theory categories, which is the regional contestation category, the domestic contestation conceptualizations, more than a category now. There are many works on that to that effect, and use these sort of concepts from role theory to analyze the case, and mostly because the role theory itself was evolving from a theory that was predominantly used to study leadership discourse, and to a theory that is using more and more interactive analysis, in which other actors, such as social actors and economic actors, were playing a role in the role enactment process as well. So my idea was to use role theory, different lines and sub-theories, to understand the interaction in a 2-level game. So I didn't use the metaphor of Robert Putnam, but now that Regina pointed out, it makes sense, and maybe there are papers out there that combine role theory and Robert Putnam, and so I think that's very, very important. The second is about when does I think that's what I understood from Regina, regional lead, or when do the roles start, right? So in order to make any constructive analysis in role theory, you can say it is a constructive theory. You have to make a decision, it's like an authoritarian decision. Where does the case start, right? So historically speaking, so when I started to study the Bolivian case, I had more or less the date. So I said, so based in around 2007, when Brazil was talking about the region, what was Brazil saying about itself? What was the predominant role that Brazil was playing on the region vis-a-vis Bolivia, but to other countries as well on that point? So regional leadership was that role, but regional leadership is a very broad concept that has many different other dependent roles inside. So you can be many types of regional leaders, right? So the idea here was trying to see if small powers could promote the transition from one type of regional leadership to another. It's not a transition from a regional leadership to a non-regional leadership. That's impossible. But then why? Because then material imbalances play a decisive role. It's impossible for Brazil to just cease to be a regional leader because of the size and the material distribution in the region. The same for India. India will never cease to be a South Asian regional leader because of the material distribution in the region. But material distribution is not enough to explain how the master role is enacted. And then it goes to I think to Carlos' question, which is very, very interesting. I didn't use this Wittgenstein inspirational that you mentioned, but I dealt with the intensity of the conditions, right? So I think that's very important. The problem is that I thought about it and I tried to more or less deal with it during the writing of the chapters, but I could never, and that's maybe there's a flaw in the studies. I could never come up with an idea of an explanation for the differences in terms of intensity, or different intensity, for example, in outer casting, right? So one thing is Bolivia having this, when I say very intensive outer cast, it's not just Evo Morales was talking, it was saying that Brazil was an imperialist country, but social society, I mean, most of the newspapers in Bolivia, a lot of people from the Evo Morales administration, even the opposition in Bolivia, who usually, as we all know, for the last election, really didn't like Morales as they don't like now, was very against Brazil because of the position that Petrobras was having on the issue. So the intensity, in a way, was the number of actors supporting and playing the outer casting with the political leadership of both Bolivia, Paraguay, and Bangladesh against the regional leader. So that's the most I can say about intensity. But you're totally right that that's something to consider in the next analysis, right? My idea, as well mentioned, is to come up with an idea of a mid-range theory, Weberianian mid-range theory, talking about necessity and sufficiency to understand how a transition of master role occurs. I think that's all. We can discuss the implications for the United States, and I can tell you right now that in order to change Brazil or any other regional power to change or even consider to change the master role of a great power, this regional power needs domestic contestation and global contestation as well. So it is always an interactive situation in which many players play similar roles in the process of changing a great power master role or a regional power master role. So, but it's something to consider. How can I apply this model that we come up with for small powers to the interaction between regional powers and great powers? So, thank you.
Thanks, Feliciano and Cameron, for your replies. We have several questions from the audience. I'm going to pick up some of them, and then I'm going to just read them very quickly. And then you just give a final reaction. You can pick up what you feel like doing, right? First one coming from, let me see the names so that I can be fair, from Bernardo Beck. How does an anti-science thinking work with populism? How is anti-science positionings of leaders associated with populism? Does it work like a support for the auxiliary ideology? Bernardo is asking. The second question is still on populism, is the following, coming from Murilo Henrique. Are there variations of populism? Can we separate populism when we speak of left-wing and right-wing populism? A specific question to Cameron. Is there any measurable difference between the discursive dimension of a populist foreign policy and the material aspects of foreign policy change? Is a populist foreign policy discourse inevitably translated into actual foreign policy, or is there a gap? To Feliciano, a question also coming from Ana Carolina Mello. Can outer casting be associated to populist discourse in the cases at hand?
Two
more final comments. My God, now there are more, but I'm not going to pick all of them. I'm not going to read all the authors because otherwise I'm going to use too much time. I guess, says this person, the concept of populism is important for comparing foreign policies. It's a different way of doing that, focusing on unit level inputs. I'd like to know if Professor Cameron has compared right-wing and left-wing populisms in Latin America. Maybe the opposite of certain populist governments will be defined by the combination of populism as a thin-centered theory and the other thick theory. Perhaps comparing left-wing and right-wing populist governments in Latin America would help to understand differences and similarities in this regard. Another question to you, Cameron. Good luck with your 5 minutes to answer all of this. A comment, not a question. It seems to me that defining populist foreign policy is an important issue to better assess the nexus between foreign policy and populism, as we should be able to distinguish between what is a populist foreign policy and what is not. Maybe it would be done by defining the traits that define each role, if they are defined in a binary stylized way, such as populist, non-populist. And one more question to Feliciano. Have you used QCA framework, CRISP set, along with process tracing in your book? And that's it. I think you have enough to end up this session. I'd like to thank all the audience members for the questions and comments. There are several others, but we won't have enough time to deal with all of them. Cameron and then Feliciano, please, to wrap up.
Okay, so I will try to be very brief in my responses since we are running short on time. Anti-scientific thought, I think the way that that typically works with populists is that populists will define scientists or people with expertise as part of the elite, right? So they're against the elite. Scientists are part of the elite. We see this in the United States with Trump and the COVID crisis, right? He stands on the podium next to, you know, our chief science officers and says exactly the opposite of the things coming out of their mouths, right? Because he thinks of them as part of the sort of elite that he is against. Yes, you can talk about left and right populism. So in the presentation today, there was an example of left populism from Chavez and right populism from Menem. And so you can see these last two waves were sort of the right and the left in Latin America, but then you can see around the world, mostly these days, sort of right populist movements. There's a lot of those around the world today. Does the discourse turn into actual foreign policy output? I think, yes, we can document this, but I think a lot more work needs to be done on this to know under what conditions populists say things that don't necessarily translate into foreign policy outputs, and under the conditions which they do it, if there is a pattern. But that would be a great area to do research on. So Leslie and I are actually supposedly working on a book project which will focus on populism in Latin America, and we should be examining all instances of left and right-wing populists, hopefully to get a better overall view of sort of their relationship to foreign policy. So hopefully that will be helpful. I don't think roles themselves could be defined as populist or not. I mean, roles can be adopted by anyone. So, you know, a populist could adopt the role of regional leader, just like a non-populist could adopt the role of regional leader. They don't have, I think, that kind of tag associated with them. Was that everything? I think I got through all the questions briefly.
Thanks a lot, Cameron. Feliciano.
So thank you for the question. Thank you, Ana Carolina, for the question. Yes, we could associate, we can use altercasting to understand populism in two different ways, which is try to understand if populist countries, populist governments use AutoCAS in their foreign policy and how they use it against other countries, like especially ideological rivals. But we can also use AutoCAS, and that goes to what Cameron said, to use. We can also use AutoCasting to understand how a populist leader AutoCasts the elite. So in order to say, you are the elite, this is not the elite. So you are the corrupt elite. If you are from the left in Brazil, if you are from the what we call the cultural sector in Brazil, from Hollywood in Brazil, so you are the elite. But if you are a farmer from the center west in Brazil, burning down the Amazon, whatever, you're not the elite. You are with me. So it AutoCasts, right? It projects an identity and a role to another actor, to others, in a way that one thinks is strategically more important for him or for her. You know? So I think you can use AutoCasting in both ways, right? For example, I have a paper coming up with about the foreign policy of Bolsonaro and international affairs next year. And we don't use AutoCasting per se, but we use the significant other concept of role theory to understand how Bolsonaro has enacted Brazil's foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States, vis-a-vis Trump, using Trump as a role model. But it would be interesting to compare to compare Bolsonaro enacting its foreign policy and look at significant other and use the AutoCasting to another ideological rival like China, for example. In the same paper, we used the case of China, but we did not use the concept of AutoCasting, because when Bolsonaro arrives in China, and then when he talks about China, the few times that he talked positively about China in Brazil or in China is that he says that China is a capitalist country. It's not a communist country, right? So this is a capitalist country. It's not a communist country. It's trying to AutoCast China in order to appease its domestic base that he's establishing a relationship with China. It's not going to change, of course, China's master role or anything, but that's the way he uses it. So just a speculation about AutoCasting. And I did not use QCA. I use just process tracing. It's a causal mechanism I was trying to understand because it has a sequence of events. So QCA is for a combination of conditions, although it looks like it could be applied for a QCA because I talk about necessity and sufficiency. I did not apply for this case specifically, especially because there's only 5 cases. In order to have a QCA, I think one needs to have at least 8 or 9 or 10 cases in order to have some variation in the conditions and the outcome. But it's something I don't have a follow-up project of this book yet. Maybe in the next couple of years I'll try something. And if I try to expand the model to more cases, maybe it'll be interesting to use QCA as a follow-up paper, having more cases of small powers interactions with regional powers. So I think these are my answers. Thank you for the questions.
Well, let me wrap this up. Maria Regina, would like you to add any comment or reaction?
Oh, that's fine with me. I think the whole session was very, very interesting. It's very challenging. We have ahead of a big work to do. Thank you, and thank you for Feliciano and Cameron.
Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
let me wrap up this session, thanking all the participants, Feliciano, Cameron, Maria Regina, for having accepted to be here with us today. Let me thank all the audience for the questions, for the comments, and let me apologize for not having been able to read out all the questions and comments because there were too many, and that perhaps shows the interest for comparative foreign policy in Brazil, which makes me very, very glad and happy. Let me also end up thanking the Brazilian Political Science Association for giving us this opportunity. And we have our next appointment during the Unbox in December under our Feliciano's and myself and my working group on, together with Monica Salomon, our working group on comparative foreign policy. And bye-bye, everyone. be safe and
Thank you.
let's
Thank
keep
you,
in touch.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.